The forest floor was a graveyard of damp leaves and broken branches, each one slick with Nyssa Vale's blood. She stumbled, her breath a ragged tear in the oppressive silence of the gloomwood, and collapsed against the ancient, moss-covered trunk of an oak. Pain was a white-hot fire in her shoulder, a searing agony where her pack mark used to be. Behind her, the howls of her pursuers echoed through the cursed trees, a sound that was once her comfort, now her terror. They were close, her vision blurred, the coppery scent of her own lifeblood thick and cloying in the air. Through the haze of her fading consciousness, she saw a shape detach itself from the gloom, a hulking, familiar wolf form. It was Jorath, a warrior she had trained alongside for years. His lips were curled back in a snarl, revealing teeth that had once snapped playfully at her heels in sparring matches. Now, they were meant for her throat. He lunged, a gray and brown blur of hate. Just as his jaws were about to close, a shadow descended. It was a wolf, but a wolf of impossible size, a creature of pitch-black fur that seemed to drink the very light from the forest. It moved with a speed that defied its mass, intercepting Jorath midair. The sound was brutal, a sickening crunch of bone and a choked-off whimper. The fight was over before it truly began. Silence, heavy and absolute, fell upon the clearing. The giant wolf stood over the broken body of its foe, its chest heaving. Then, with a grace that seemed unnatural for a creature of such power, it shifted. Bones cracked and reformed, fur receded, and a man stood in its place. He was immense, a figure of raw power and regal presence, his naked form looking as though it were carved from the mountain stone itself. His eyes, even in the dim light, glowed with a faint ethereal silver. He moved toward the dying Nyssa, kneeling before her, his gaze locking onto hers. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a sound of pure, possessive recognition that vibrated through her very soul, chasing away the cold of impending death. "Mine, the Alpha King, Dominic Raine," declared, his voice echoing with an ancient power that stilled the cursed forest and sealed her fate. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. 3 days earlier, the sun had shone brightly on the Silvermoon Pack. Their village was a testament to prosperity, nestled in a vibrant, sun-dappled forest where the air smelled of pine, baking bread, and the earthy musk of happy wolves. Nyssa was a respected warrior, her skill with a blade second only to her loyalty. She moved with a fluid grace across the packed earth of the training circle, her wooden practice sword a blur as she parried a heavy blow from Kale, the Alpha's son and her betrothed. His movements were powerful, aggressive, each swing a testament to his ambition. Their dynamic was a constant, tense dance. He was hungry for power, his eyes always on the future, on the Alpha title that would one day be his. Nyssa, however, was grounded, her loyalty pledged not to a title, but to the pack itself, to its traditions, and its people. "You're holding back," Kale grunted, pressing his advantage. His shoulder slammed into hers, and she used the momentum to spin away, her own blade tapping his ribs in a clean, undeniable point. "I'm fighting smart," she countered, her voice even. "Power is useless without control, Kale." He scowled, his handsome face tightening. "Control is for those who fear their own strength." From the sidelines, her best friend Lyra watched them. Her expression was a complex tapestry of admiration for Kale's raw charisma and a subtle, sharp envy directed at Nyssa, an envy Nyssa had always chosen to ignore. Lyra was like a sister to her, and she refused to see the shadows lurking behind her friend's gentle smile. The village bustled around them, a picture of idyllic life. Pups tumbled in the grass, elders shared stories in the shade of the great lodge, and the scent of roasting meat promised a communal feast. It was a world of safety, of belonging, a world about to be torn from Nyssa's grasp. The first sign of the end came not as a roar, but as a choked cry from the Alpha's lodge. Panic, a scent as sharp and acrid as poison, ripped through the peaceful afternoon. Alpha Marcus, Kale's father and a leader beloved for his steady wisdom, had collapsed. He was gravely ill, his breath coming in shallow, pained gasps. The pack healer emerged from the lodge, her face pale, her hands trembling. "It's a rare poison," she announced to the gathering crowd, her voice barely a whisper. "Blackroot and Silverbane, I've never seen it used on one of our own." The words hung in the air, thick and venomous. This was no accident. It was treason. In the ensuing chaos, Kale stepped forward. The grief on his face was a mask, poorly worn, and beneath it, his eyes burned with a cold, terrifying fire. He seized control with an authority that felt rehearsed, his voice ringing out over the panicked murmurs. He let the silence stretch, building the tension until it was a palpable thing, a weight pressing down on every wolf present. Then, he raised a trembling, accusatory finger and pointed it directly at Nyssa. "She has betrayed us all," he roared, his voice cracking with feigned anguish. "I saw her meeting with rogues in the dead of night, her hands stained with the very poison that now weakens my father." A collective gasp swept through the pack. Heads turned, eyes wide with shock and disbelief, all focusing on Nyssa, her world tilted on its axis. The accusation was so monstrous, so utterly insane, that for a moment she could only stare at him, her mind refusing to process the words. Rogues? Poison? It was a lie, a grotesque fabrication. She opened her mouth to deny it, to scream her innocence, but Kale gave her no chance. "I have a witness," he bellowed, his gaze sweeping the crowd until it landed on Lyra. "Lyra, come forward. Tell them what you saw." Every head turned toward Lyra. She looked small and fragile as she stepped into the circle, her eyes downcast, her shoulders slumped. Nyssa's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Lyra would tell them the truth. She would expose this lie for what it was. She was her friend, her sister, but when Lyra finally looked up, her eyes were filled with tears, and she wasn't looking at Nyssa. She was looking at the crowd, at the faces of the packmates she was about to betray. "I saw it too," Lyra whispered, her voice choked with manufactured sobs. Nyssa felt the words like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She spoke of a new order, of how Alpha Marcus was too weak to lead. "I didn't want to believe it, but Kale is right. The pain of that lie was sharper than any blade." It was a deep, soul-tearing wound that eclipsed the absurdity of Kale's accusation. Nyssa looked from Lyra's tear-streaked, deceitful face to the faces of her pack. She saw the people she had grown up with, fought beside, protected, and in their eyes, where once there was respect and affection, she now saw only suspicion, then doubt, and finally, a chilling, unified hatred. The crackling of the ceremonial fire in the center of the village suddenly sounded like laughter. The familiar scent of pine was now mixed with the stench of fear and betrayal. A cold, heavy dread settled in Nyssa's stomach, a stone of despair that threatened to pull her down into the earth. There was no trial. Kale's word, backed by Lyra's, was law. Two of Kale's brutish enforcers grabbed Nyssa's arms, their grips like iron bands, and dragged her toward the fire. She didn't fight. Her limbs were numb, her spirit shattered. Kale stood waiting, his face a mask of grim righteousness. In his hand, he held a long iron rod, its end glowing a malevolent orange from the flames. On its tip was the crescent moon symbol of the Silver Moon Pack, her symbol, her identity. "Nyssa Vale," Kale intoned, his voice devoid of any emotion save for a chilling satisfaction. "For the crime of treason, for conspiring to murder your alpha, you are hereby stripped of your name, your rank, and your pack." He pressed the heated iron to her left shoulder. The smell of burning flesh and hair filled the air. Nyssa screamed, a raw animal sound of agony that was torn from the depths of her soul. But the physical torment, the searing of her skin and muscle, was nothing compared to the spiritual agony that followed. She felt the pack bond, the invisible, sacred tether that connected her to every member of Silvermoon, stretch, fray, and then snap. The severance was a violent void, a spiritual amputation that left her utterly, terrifyingly alone. She was no longer Nyssa of Silvermoon. She was an outcast, a rogue, prey. Kale threw the iron to the ground, where it hissed on the damp earth. He looked down at her, his eyes cold and merciless. "She is no longer Silvermoon. She is nothing," he shouted to the assembled wolves, who now looked at her as if she were a rabid animal. "Hunt her down. Let her die in the gloomwood as a warning to all traitors." The hunt began immediately. She was given no supplies, no weapon, only the tattered remains of her training clothes and the blistering weeping wound on her shoulder. She was forced to her feet and shoved toward the edge of the forest, the dark, foreboding line of trees that marked the border of the cursed gloomwood. She ran, heartbroken, betrayed, and grievously wounded. She plunged into the wilderness, the howls of her former family, now her hunters, rising in a bloodthirsty chorus behind her. Nyssa awoke to a disorienting sensation: silence. It was a deep, profound quiet that felt alien after days of panicked flight and the cacophony of the hunt. The hard, unforgiving forest floor was gone, replaced by a surface so soft she felt as though she were floating. A gentle weight rested over her, a blanket woven from what felt like spun clouds. She forced her heavy eyelids open, blinking against a soft, golden light. Sunlight, clean and warm, streamed through magnificent arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing like tiny, glittering sprites in the air. Her gaze drifted across a vast, opulent bedchamber. The bed she lay in was a fortress of carved dark wood and plush velvet hangings. Intricate tapestries covered the stone walls, their threads depicting scenes of legendary wolves, their fur rendered in shimmering silver and gold, locked in ancient epic battles against monstrous beasts. Her wounds, the gnawing fire in her shoulder, and the dozens of cuts and bruises from her desperate flight no longer screamed for attention. They were a dull, distant ache. She pushed herself up slowly, the fine linen sheets pooling around her waist. Her shoulder was expertly dressed, wrapped in clean white bandages that smelled faintly of honey and mountain herbs. The fragrant salve had cooled the burn to a manageable throb. The room was peaceful, a sanctuary of impossible luxury, but the tranquility did nothing to soothe the frantic terror coiling in her gut. This was not safety. It was a cage, a gilded one, but a cage nonetheless. Her warrior instincts, long dormant beneath the shock of betrayal, flared to life. She was a prisoner. The heavy wooden door swung open with a soft click, and he entered. Dominic Raine, the Alpha King. He was dressed now, not in the raw, naked power of his shifted form, but in simple, dark trousers and a loose-fitting white tunic that did little to conceal the formidable strength of his frame. His presence was immense, filling the room, commanding the very air she breathed. He stopped several feet from the bed, his silver eyes tracking her every movement as she instinctively pulled the sheets higher, a futile barrier against his overwhelming power. He said nothing, simply watching her, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. It was Nyssa who broke it, her voice a raw, gritty thing, torn from a throat, still hoarse from screaming. "Where am I? Why did you bring me here?" Dominic's gaze softened almost imperceptibly. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, a low baritone that carried an undercurrent of absolute power, the same power that had stilled the gloomwood. "You are in my castle, my home, and I brought you here because you belong here." Nyssa's laugh was a bitter, broken sound. "I belong nowhere. My pack cast me out. I am rogue." "You are not rogue," he stated, the words not a contradiction but a declaration of fact. "My wolf and my soul recognized you in the forest. The fates have bound us. You are my mate, Nyssa, my Luna." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Mate, Luna. Titles she had once dreamed of, titles that were now ashes in her mouth. He spoke of the sacred bond, the unbreakable link that his wolf had recognized in her, as if it were a gift. To her, it was just another chain. She pulled herself fully upright, ignoring the protest of her bruised ribs and the sharp pull on her shoulder. She met his gaze, her own eyes, once warm and brown, now hard and cold as river stones. "I belong to no one," she snarled, her voice laced with the venom of her recent betrayal. "I was betrayed by my own blood, my own betrothed, my own friend. I will not trade one cage for another. Your claim, your bond, it means nothing to me." A flicker of something, perhaps surprise or even pain, crossed his features before being suppressed. He took a step closer, and she flinched, her body tensing for a fight she knew she could not win. "It is not a cage," he said, his voice still impossibly patient. "It is your destiny, our destiny. My destiny was to die in that forest." She shot back. "You should have left me there." He did not argue further. Instead, After ensuring she had eaten from a tray of food that appeared as if by magic, he insisted she accompany him. He wanted to show her the castle, her new home, her prison. Dressed in a simple but elegant gown of deep green that had been left for her, Nyssa walked at his side, a chasm of silence and suspicion between them. His presence sent ripples of shock and disapproval through the royal court. As they moved through the cavernous great hall, where hundreds of wolves in fine attire paused their conversations to stare, Nyssa felt the weight of their gazes like a physical pressure. The whispers followed them, a sibilant tide of judgment. A rogue? Look at the scar on her arm, she's been marked. The king defies tradition. She must have bewitched him. She felt like an animal on display, a feral creature dragged from the wild to be gawked at by the civilized. Her inner monologue was a torrent of fear, anger, and a deep, aching loneliness that was more painful than any wound. She was scarred by betrayal, terrified of trusting anyone, especially an alpha king whose power was absolute and whose people so clearly despised her. She kept her head high, her expression a mask of cold indifference she was far from feeling. She watched Dominic, trying to find the tyrant beneath the handsome face, the monster that must surely lurk behind those silver eyes. But she saw only a man burdened by duty, his jaw tight, his gaze sweeping over his subjects with an air of authority that was tempered by a profound weariness. He led her to the throne room, a magnificent hall with a vaulted ceiling that soared into shadow. At the far end, upon a raised dais, sat two thrones carved from white stone and gold. One was massive, imposing. The other, slightly smaller, sat empty beside it. He showed her the battlements, where sentries in gleaming armor stood watch over a kingdom that stretched to the horizon, a tapestry of green forests, silver rivers, and distant mountains. As they stood there, a grizzled, powerfully built wolf with a scarred face and shrewd eyes approached them. He bowed low to Dominic, but his eyes were fixed on Nyssa, sharp and calculating. "My king," the man said, his voice a low rumble. "A word, if I may." Dominic nodded, and the man, whom Nyssa recognized from court whispers as Lord Valerius, his most trusted advisor, pulled him aside. His voice was a low warning, but Nyssa's keen hearing caught every word. "My king, you defy centuries of tradition. The council will not accept a disgraced rogue as their Luna. This will be seen as a weakness. It invites rebellion from the regional alphas. They will see your judgment as clouded." Nyssa watched Dominic's back stiffen. His profile was like that of the kings on ancient coins, hard and uncompromising. "I will not defy the bond," Dominic replied, his voice quiet but ringing with steel. "She is my mate. The council will accept her, or they will answer to me." Valerius bowed his head, but his expression remained grim as he retreated. Dominic turned back to Nyssa, his face unreadable, but she had seen it all. The disapproval, the political maneuvering, the threat of war, all because of her. She was not just a prisoner, she was a problem, a catalyst for chaos in a kingdom she had never asked to be a part of. That night, sleep offered no escape. It dragged her back into the darkness, back to the moment of her undoing. She was in the village square again, the fire crackling, the faces of her packmates twisted with hatred. She felt the searing heat of the iron as it neared her shoulder, smelled the sickening stench of her own burning flesh. The pain was so real, so vivid, that it stole her breath. She saw Lyra's face, her eyes swimming with false tears, her mouth forming the lies that had condemned her. "I saw it too," the dream Lyra whispered, and the sound was a serpent hissing in her ear. Then came the worst part, the feeling of the pack bond, the spiritual sinew that had connected her to her people for her entire life, snapping like a frayed rope. The severance was a physical agony, a void opening inside her chest, a hollow emptiness that echoed with the loss of everything she had ever been. She woke with a strangled cry, bolting upright in the massive bed, her body drenched in a cold sweat, the phantom pain in her shoulder burning with an intensity that felt terrifyingly real. The sound of her own scream still hung in the silent room. The door to her chamber burst open so violently it slammed against the stone wall. Dominic stood there, framed in the doorway, his chest heaving as if he had run the length of the castle. His eyes, wide with a raw, primal concern, found her in the darkness. He took a step into the room, then another, his powerful form radiating a protective energy that was almost overwhelming. He stopped short of the bed, sensing her fear, seeing the way she shrank back into the pillows, her hands raised as if to ward him off. He saw the terror in her eyes, a terror that was not of him, but of the ghosts that haunted her, and he stopped. He didn't move closer. He didn't speak. He didn't offer empty words of comfort that she would have only rejected. He simply stood there, a solid, unmoving anchor in the terrifying darkness of her mind. His presence was a silent promise, a quiet guard against the nightmares. He stayed, a silent, silver-eyed sentinel, until her frantic trembling subsided and her ragged breaths evened out. This small act of restraint, this profound understanding of her fear, without a single word being spoken, spoke louder than any declaration of possession. It was the first time since her world had shattered that she did not feel entirely alone. Seeking a refuge from the suffocating opulence of her chambers and the even more suffocating weight of Dominic's silent concern, Nyssa wandered the castle's stone corridors. She felt like a ghost, haunting a life that was not her own. It was by accident that she found it, a pair of towering oak doors, intricately carved with images of wolves reading from scrolls under a canopy of trees. Pushing one open, she stepped into a sanctuary of silence and knowledge, the royal library. It was a space so vast it seemed to defy the castle's physical dimensions. Sunlight, filtered through stained, glass windows high above, cast long, colorful shafts of light across endless rows of shelves that soared 3 stories high, connected by spiraling wrought iron staircases. The air smelled of aged paper, leather bindings, and beeswax polish, a scent that was clean, ancient, and deeply calming. For the first time since she had fled into the gloomwood, Nyssa felt a measure of peace settle over her. Here, there were no judging eyes, no political whispers, only the quiet companionship of stories and histories bound in leather. She lost herself for hours, pulling down heavy tomes, her fingers tracing the faded gold leaf on their spines. She read about the history of the great pacts, the ancient laws that governed the kingdom, and the legends of the first alphas. It was a world away from her pain, a balm on her fractured soul. She was so engrossed in a detailed account of the formation of the Alpha Council that she didn't hear him enter. When she finally looked up, he was there. Dominic was not there to confront her, not to press his claim, but simply to share the space. He chose a table across the vast room, a respectful distance away, and settled down with a stack of royal decrees, his brow furrowed in concentration. He did not speak to her, but every so often, she would feel his gaze on her and look up to find his silver eyes watching her, a quiet, contemplative look on his face before he would give a small, almost imperceptible nod and return to his work. The shared silence was not awkward or tense. It was comfortable. It was a silent truce, an unspoken acknowledgement that they could exist in the same space without conflict. It was a fragile beginning. Days later, drawn by the rhythmic clash of steel on steel, Nyssa found her way to the main training grounds. It was a vast, packed earth courtyard, bustling with activity. She stood in the shadow of an archway, a silent observer. In the center of the yard, stripped to the waist, his body, a testament to years of relentless training, was Dominic. He moved with a deadly grace that belied his size, his practiced sword a blur of silver as he sparred with 3 of his elite royal guard simultaneously. He was not just a king who commanded from a throne. He was a warrior who led from the front. He parried a blow from his left, spun inside the guard of a warrior on his right, and used the pommel of his sword to disarm the third in a single, fluid motion that was breathtaking in its efficiency and power. He commanded not just obedience, but a deep, unwavering respect that was earned through sweat and skill. He was a true warrior king. As his men yielded, panting and shaking their heads in grudging admiration, his gaze swept the courtyard and landed on her. He saw her standing there, half hidden in the shadows. For a long moment, their eyes met across the yard. He didn't smile, nor did his expression change, but after disarming his last opponent with a final, decisive tap, he gave her a sharp, appraising nod. It was not the nod of a king to a subject, or a male to a female he wished to claim. It was the silent, profound acknowledgement of one warrior to another, In that single, simple gesture, he saw past the rogue, past the mate, and saw the warrior she had been, the warrior she still was. It was a small thing, but it chipped another piece from the icy wall she had built around her heart. The fragile piece of their silent truce was shattered by the thunder of hooves in the main courtyard. A messenger, his horse lathered and heaving, slid from the saddle and ran into the castle, his face grim. He bore a formal decree, sealed with the crescent moon of the silver moon pack. Dominic summoned Nyssa to his private study, the same room where he had stood silent vigil over her nightmares. Lord Valerius was already there, his face a mask of grim concern. Dominic held the unrolled scroll in his hand, his knuckles white. "Kyle has made his move," Dominic said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "He has formally accused me, before the entire regional council of Alphas, of harboring a dangerous criminal and attempting to destabilize the kingdom." He read from the scroll, his voice dripping with contempt. "He claims you are a seductress, a traitor who has used dark magic to cloud my mind and usurp the rightful power of the packs. He has petitioned the other Alphas to form a coalition, to march on this castle and liberate the kingdom from my compromised rule." Nyssa felt the blood drain from her face. Kale was not just defending his lie, he was escalating it, twisting her into a weapon to use against the very man who had saved her. He was challenging the Alpha King himself. The political threat was no longer a whisper in the halls. It was a declaration of war. Dominic immediately convened his war council. The chamber was a stark, stone room dominated by a massive round table, its surface covered in maps of the kingdom. The air was thick with tension as Dominic laid out the situation. His most senior advisors, grizzled alphas and betas who had served his father before him, listened in grim silence. It was Lord Valerius who spoke first, his voice heavy with pragmatism. "Sacrifice the one to save the many, my king," he argued, his gaze carefully avoiding Nyssa, who stood near the door, feeling like a ghost at her own trial. "A war over a rogue female, no matter the truth of the matter, will shatter the kingdom. The other Alphas are proud. They will not easily accept that one of their own, Kale, is a liar. Hand her over to a neutral pack for judgment, appease the council. It is the only political solution." The other advisors murmured their assent, their faces etched with the grim reality of Valerius's words. They were willing to sacrifice her, to throw her back to the wolves to avoid a war. Nyssa's heart turned to ice. She had expected this, but the reality of it was still a blow. To them, she was a pawn, a political inconvenience. She looked at Dominic, expecting to see the cold calculation of a king in his eyes. Instead, she saw a storm gathering. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his most trusted men. Then, with a sudden violent motion, he slammed his fist onto the stone table. The sound cracked through the chamber like a thunderclap, making the advisors jolt. The maps jumped, and a silver goblet overturned, spilling red wine like blood across the parchment. Dominic rose slowly to his full, intimidating height, his eyes flashing with a dangerous inner silver light, the power of the Alpha King radiating from him in palpable waves. "She is not a rogue," he snarled, his voice low and lethal, a sound that promised death to any who defied him. "She is my mate, and I am your king." He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table, his gaze pinning each advisor in place. "We will not sacrifice justice for politics. We will not bow to the threats of a treacherous pup who poisons his own father. We will expose the lies, ready the men. If Kale wants a war, he will find that the wolf he has provoked is far more than he can handle." The council was silent, the advisors stunned into submission by the raw, untamed power of their king. There would be no more talk of sacrifice. That evening, after dismissing his council with sharp, decisive orders, Dominic found Nyssa staring out a window, her arms wrapped around herself. He didn't speak of the council, of the impending war. Instead, he simply said, "Join me for dinner, in my study." She was hesitant, but she went. The study was a warm, intimate space, a stark contrast to the cold formality of the rest of the castle. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing glow on the leather, bound books and strategic maps that lined the walls. A small table had been set for two near the flames. There were no servants, no advisors. It was just them. As they ate a simple meal of roasted fowl and bread, he didn't press her. He didn't talk about the mate bond or her duties as a Luna. Instead, he asked her about her life before. He asked about her training, about the family she had lost long ago, about the things she loved before the betrayal. Hesitantly at first, then with more ease, she found herself telling him about the way the forest smelled after a rain, about the pride she felt when a young wolf she had trained finally bested her in a spar, about her father's quiet strength. In return, he shared stories of his own, of the crushing pressure of becoming king so young after his parents were killed in a rogue attack, of the loneliness of the crown. For the first time, she was not talking to the Alpha King, the imposing monarch, the possessive mate. She was talking to Dominic, and she was seeing the man, not the monarch, a man who carried the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders but whose eyes held a deep, profound loneliness that mirrored her own. The hour grew late, and the fire burned down to glowing embers. A comfortable quiet settled between them, a kind shared by old friends, not by a king and his prisoner. Nyssa knew she should leave, that this fragile peace was dangerous, that letting her guard down was a mistake. She rose to her feet, murmuring her thanks for the meal. As she turned to go, her foot caught on the edge of a thick wolfskin rug that lay before the hearth. She stumbled, a small, undignified gasp escaping her lips as she pitched forward. Dominic's reflexes were instantaneous, a blur of motion born from 1,000 battles. He shot to his feet and his hand darted out, his strong fingers wrapping around her upper arm to steady her. The contact was like a lightning strike. The moment his skin touched hers, the mate bond, which had been a quiet, humming presence in the back of her mind, flared to life. It was not a jolt of possession or a demand, but a current of pure, unadulterated energy, a wave of warmth and strength that traveled from his hand, up her arm, and straight into the hollow, aching space in her heart. It was protective. It was solid. It was a feeling of absolute safety, a feeling she had not known since before her mother's death. She flinched away on instinct, her heart hammering against her ribs like a frantic drum. She pulled her arm from his grasp, her breath catching in her throat. But the sensation lingered, a confusing, terrifying, wonderful mix of fear and a deep, primal longing she refused to name. She fled the room without another word, but she could not flee the feeling. The seed of trust, planted in the silent library and nurtured by a warrior's nod, had finally, terrifyingly, begun to sprout. The king's study was a fortress of silence, but Nyssa's heart was a battlefield. She had fled from him, from the shocking, undeniable warmth that had flooded her veins when he had caught her. Now, pacing the cold stone floor of her own opulent chamber, the memory of his touch was a brand, more potent and far more terrifying than the one Kale had seared into her flesh. That mark had been about severance, about being cast out. This new sensation was the opposite, a feeling of being anchored, of being seen, and it threatened to pull her under. She could not afford to drown. Trust was a luxury for those who had never felt the knife of betrayal in their back, and hers had been wielded by the two people she loved most. To believe in this king, in this bond, felt like the ultimate folly. Yet, as she paced, another feeling began to stir beneath the fear, a low, simmering anger. She was tired of being a victim. She was tired of hiding, of reacting, of being a pawn in a game she hadn't chosen. She was a warrior. Her life had been stolen from her based on a lie, and while she had been cowering in the shadows of this castle, Dominic had been preparing to wage a war in her name. He had defied his counsel for her. He had stood guard over her nightmares. He had looked at her and seen a warrior. The memory of his nod in the training yard, a simple gesture of respect, was a spark in the darkness of her despair. Dominic stood in his study, the remnants of their shared meal a cold reminder of the fragile peace that had been shattered. He poured a goblet of deep red wine, not for pleasure, but to steady the tremor of rage that ran through him. Kale's arrogance was astounding. To challenge a king was suicide, but to do so using the king's own mate as the justification, that was an insult that could only be answered in blood. He would not sacrifice Nyssa. The thought was so alien, so fundamentally impossible, that it was like trying to imagine the sun rising in the west. He would burn his entire kingdom to the ground before he let anyone harm her. But a war would cost thousands of lives. Valerius was right about that. The only way to avert it was with undeniable proof. Proof that would turn Kale's allies against him. He walked to the hearth and threw a pinch of dried herbs into the flames. They flared, turning a brilliant spectral green for a moment before dying down. A minute passed in complete silence. Then, a section of the stone wall beside the fireplace shimmered, and a figure seemed to detach itself from the shadows. It was a wolf of medium build, with fur the color of twilight gray, so perfectly blended with the stone that he was invisible until he moved. He shifted silently, becoming a man of indeterminate age, with eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing. He wore simple, dark leathers and carried no visible weapon, yet he was arguably the most dangerous wolf in the kingdom. "Ghost," Dominic said, his voice low. The spymaster inclined his head, his gaze unwavering. "My king, I have a task for you. I need you to infiltrate the Silver Moon Pack. Kale has accused Nyssa of poisoning his father. It's a lie. I need proof. Anything. A witness who was silenced, a merchant who sold a rare herb, whispers in the barracks. Find the loose thread and pull." Ghost simply nodded again, a flicker of understanding in his unnervingly still eyes. "It will be done." He turned and with 2 silent steps seemed to melt back into the stone wall, leaving no trace he had ever been there. Nyssa's pacing stopped. A memory, hazy and unimportant at the time, suddenly sharpened in her mind with painful clarity. It was from a week before the poisoning. She had been returning from a patrol along the northern border and had seen Kale speaking with someone in a thicket of trees, far from the main path. She had assumed it was a clandestine meeting with a lover, or perhaps a secret deal for hunting rights. But the man he was with was not Silver Moon. He was large, brutish, and had the feral look of a career rogue, and on his wrist, she had seen it for just a second, a tattoo of a fanged wolf skull, the mark of the Bloodfang mercenaries, assassins and thugs for hire who operated out of the lawless territories to the south. The thought, the connection, was a jolt of electricity. She had to tell him. She could not stand by while he fought for her truth with only his faith to guide him. She had a weapon to give him. Her feet carried her through the silent corridors, back to the study. She pushed the door open without knocking. Dominic looked up from the maps he had been staring at, his expression startled. "Nyssa," he said, his voice laced with concern. "Are you all right?" She walked toward him, her heart pounding a different rhythm now, not of fear, but of purpose. "I remember something," she said, her voice steady. "A week before Alpha Marcus was poisoned, I saw Kale. He was meeting with someone in secret." Dominic's full attention was on her now, his silver eyes intense. "A rogue. Kale told me later he was dealing with a border dispute, but that wasn't true. This man wasn't a simple skirmisher. He was an assassin for hire." She took a deep breath, the image solidifying in her memory. "I saw the Bloodfang mark tattooed on his wrist." The air in the room crackled, Dominic's eyes widened, and a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. It was not a smile of humor, but of a predator who has just caught the scent of his prey. This was it. The loose thread. The Bloodfang. He breathed, the name a curse on his tongue. This changed everything. It was no longer a search for a whisper, a rumor. It was a hunt for a specific man. He strode to his desk, scribbled a hasty note, and sealed it with his royal crest. He then pulled a cord, and within seconds, a guard appeared. "Find the rider I dispatched not 10 minutes ago," Dominic commanded. "Give him this. It is urgent. He is to deliver it to Ghost, wherever he may be." The next day, the castle was a hive of tense activity. The armory rang with the sound of hammers on steel, and the courtyards were filled with warriors running drills. The air was thick with the metallic scent of war. Dominic found Nyssa in the library, but she wasn't reading. She was staring out the window, her expression lost and haunted. He saw the toll the waiting was taking on her. "Come," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You need to get out of here." He led her not to the war room or the council chambers, but to the royal stables. The scent of clean hay and horse was a welcome change. He led her to two magnificent beasts, a jet-black stallion for himself and a spirited gray mare for her. "Can you ride?" he asked. She simply gave him a look that said she was born in the saddle. They left the castle behind, galloping across the open plains that surrounded the capital. The wind tore at her hair, whipping it back from her face, and the rhythmic, powerful motion of the horse beneath her was a liberating force. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she wasn't running from something. She was just running. They raced, leaving the grim reality of the castle far behind. Dominic pushed his stallion, and Nyssa urged her mare on, a fierce, joyful laugh bubbling up out of her, a sound she thought had died in the gloomwood. For a few precious hours, she felt a sense of freedom she thought she had lost forever. He led her deep into the ancient forests of his kingdom, a world away from the cursed, oppressive gloomwood. Here, the trees were tall and proud, the sunlight dappled the forest floor, and the air was alive with the sound of birdsong. They stopped by a waterfall that cascaded down a series of moss-covered rock faces into a crystal-clear pool. The roar of the water was a cleansing sound. They dismounted, letting the horses drink from the pool. Nyssa walked to the water's edge, the cool spray misting her face. The beauty of the place, combined with Dominic's quiet, undemanding companionship, allowed her to finally breathe, to let the tension in her shoulders ease. As she watched the water, she saw his reflection next to hers. He wasn't looking at her, but at the land around them, his expression one of deep, abiding love for his domain. She saw the unwavering belief he had placed in her, a belief he was willing to stake his kingdom on. She saw his quiet strength, the honor with which he ruled, the restraint he showed when she was at her most vulnerable. The walls around her heart, the fortress of ice and pain she had built, were not just cracking, they were melting under the steady warmth of his conviction. She began to wonder, for the first time, if the mate bond wasn't a curse. Perhaps, just perhaps, it was something else entirely. They returned to the castle as dusk was painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The fragile peace of the afternoon was immediately shattered. Valerius met them in the courtyard, his face grim. "Ghost has returned, my king. He awaits you in the study." They found him standing by the fire, as silent and still as a statue. The room was dark, save for the flickering firelight. Nyssa's heart began to pound, a frantic drum against her ribs. This was the moment of truth. Ghost bowed his head as they entered. "I found him," he said, his voice a dry whisper. "The Bloodfang mercenary. His name is Rorik. He was easy to persuade." Ghost's definition of persuasion, Nyssa knew, would be a brutal one. He confessed everything. Kale hired him 2 weeks ago. The job was twofold. First, to procure a slow-acting poison, one that would mimic a wasting sickness. Second, to stage a rogue attack on the northern patrols a few days later, an attack that Kale himself would heroically repel, cementing his popularity with the warriors just as his father's health began to fail. The ugly, twisted genius of the plan was laid bare. It was perfect in its cruelty. Ghost reached into his tunic and pulled out 2 items. The first was a piece of parchment, a signed confession from the mercenary, his signature a shaky, terrified scrawl. The second was a crumpled, tear-stained letter. "We found this in the mercenary's payment pouch," Ghost explained. It was part of his final payment. "A bonus," he said. Dominic took the letter and held it out for Nyssa. Her hands trembled as she took it. She recognized the elegant, looping handwriting immediately. It was Lyra's. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words that would either be her final condemnation or her ultimate vindication. Asterisk, my dearest Kale. Asterisk, the letter began. Asterisk. The deed is done, the old man weakens, and the pack looks to you. The warriors sing your praises after you drove off the rogues so bravely. Everything is going as you planned, but my heart is sick with fear and guilt. Seeing Nyssa's face when I spoke, it will haunt me forever. But I do it for you, for us. You promised me, Kale. You promised that when she was gone, when you were Alpha, you would make me your Luna. You promised I would be the one at your side. Please, my love, tell me you will keep your promise, now that Nyssa is gone forever. Asterisk. The letter fell from her numb fingers. The truth was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. The sheer, calculated depth of the conspiracy, the casual cruelty of it, was uglier and more painful than she could have ever imagined. But beneath the pain, there was something else, a profound, liberating relief. The brand of traitor, which had been burned not just on her skin but into her very soul, was finally, blessedly, lifted. She was innocent. Dominic didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't gloat or celebrate his victory. He simply stood by her, his presence a solid wall of support. And when a single, hot tear escaped her control and traced a silent path down her cheek, he gently, almost reverently, reached out and wiped it away with the pad of his thumb. His touch was warm, his calloused skin impossibly soft against hers. And this time, Nyssa didn't pull back. The king's study was a crucible, the air thick with the ashes of a devastating truth. Dominic's decree went out on the swiftest horses, a summons that was less an invitation and more a command. Every alpha in the kingdom was called to an emergency council at the capital. The parchment, sealed with the snarling wolf's head of the royal crest, was uncompromising. It stated that the king would present irrefutable evidence concerning the honor of his chosen mate and would pass judgment on the treachery that threatened to plunge the kingdom into war. There was no room for refusal. To ignore the summons was to declare oneself an enemy of the crown. The days leading up to the council were a blur of tense preparation. The castle hummed with the energy of a gathering storm. Nyssa was no longer a ghost haunting the library. The fire of vindication had burned away her fear, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. She found her place not in the opulent chambers she had been given, but in the stark, stone war room, amidst the maps and strategic markers. At first, she stood at the periphery, a silent shadow watching Dominic and his advisors plan for a war she had inadvertently caused. They spoke of troop movements, of supply lines, and of the Silver Moon Pact's defenses. Valerius, pointing to a map of Nyssa's former home, outlined the main approaches. Kale will have the valley pass heavily guarded, and the river crossing will be trapped. His primary defenses will be concentrated here and here. Nyssa stepped forward, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the low murmur of the council. No, not the river crossing. All eyes turned to her. She moved to the table, her finger tracing a line on the worn parchment. Kale is arrogant. He believes his own strength is enough. He always neglects the eastern ridge. The patrols there are infrequent, and the terrain is difficult, but a small, skilled force could move through the shadows of the foothills and be at the village's edge before the main alarm is ever sounded. She looked up, meeting Valerius's skeptical gaze without flinching. I know his mind. I know how he thinks. He sees threats head-on. He will not be watching his flank. A slow, grudging respect dawned in Valerius's shrewd eyes. He studied the map, then looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time not as a political problem, but as a tactical asset. She has the mind of a beta, he murmured to the king, the words a high compliment from the grizzled warrior. Dominic, who had been watching Nyssa with an expression of immense pride, laid a hand on her shoulder, his touch both a support and a statement to the room. A slow smile touched his lips. She has the mind of a queen, he corrected, his voice resonating with quiet conviction. The night before the council arrived, thick with an almost unbearable tension. Nyssa stood on her balcony, the cool night air doing little to calm the frantic beating of her heart. Tomorrow, she would face them all. The men who had judged her without a trial, the alphas who saw her as a rogue, a seductress, a harbinger of war. A soft knock came at her door. It was Dominic. He carried no scrolls, no maps, only a long, velvet-wrapped bundle. He came to her chambers, not as a king, but as a man. He placed the bundle on her bed and unwrapped it. Inside was a gown of deep midnight blue, the fabric so fine it seemed to have been spun from the night sky itself. It was embroidered with shimmering silver thread that traced elegant, subtle patterns like moonlight on water. With it was a heavy, silver pendant on a thick chain. It was the royal crest of the Alpha King, a snarling wolf's head, its eyes tiny diamonds, crowned with a single brilliant star. It was a statement of power, of belonging. Tomorrow, Dominic said, his voice a low, intimate rumble that was meant only for her. He picked up the heavy pendant, its silver cool against his skin. They will not see a rogue. They will not see an outcast. He stepped closer, his silver eyes holding hers, his gaze burning with an intensity that stole her breath. He lifted the chain and settled the pendant around her neck. The metal was heavy against her collarbones, a solid, tangible weight. An anchor. They will see their Luna. He paused, his fingers brushing the side of her neck, sending a jolt of warmth through her. My Luna. The great hall was a cauldron of power and hostility. Hundreds of the most powerful wolves in the kingdom were assembled, their fine tunics and leather armor doing little to conceal the raw, predatory energy that radiated from them. The air was thick with tension and testosterone, a heady mix of suspicion and aggression. Alpha Kale stood with his father, Marcus, who looked frail but smug, surrounded by a contingent of their most loyal warriors. Kale's expression was one of supreme arrogance, the look of a man who believed he had already won. Behind them, a ghost in a fine gown, stood Lyra. Her face was pale as bone, her eyes wide and terrified, darting around the hall as if seeking an escape she knew she would not find. A hush fell as the great doors at the end of the hall swung open. King Dominic entered, and the sheer force of his presence commanded an immediate, grudging silence. He walked with a slow, deliberate confidence, his silver eyes sweeping over the assembled alphas, missing nothing. He wore the black and silver of his royal house, a sword at his hip, the crown of the Alpha King on his brow. He reached the dais and turned to face the assembly, but he did not sit. He waited. Then, a second figure appeared in the doorway. It was Nyssa. A collective gasp, a ripple of shock and outrage, swept through the hall. She was radiant, a vision of impossible grace and power in the midnight blue gown that seemed to drink the light. The royal crest lay heavy and brilliant against her chest, a defiant star against a night sky. Her head was held high, her expression serene, her gaze sweeping over the hostile faces without a trace of fear. She walked the length of the hall, the sound of her steps echoing in the stunned silence, and came to stand at Dominic's side. Dominic let the shock settle, letting the alphas stare, letting them see the woman he had claimed, not as a cowering rogue, but as a regal consort. "You were summoned," Dominic's voice boomed, amplified by the hall's acoustics, "to hear a judgment. But before judgment is passed, you will hear a testimony." He turned his gaze to Nyssa, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. He gestured to the center of the hall. "The floor is yours, my lady." Nyssa walked forward alone, her steps sure and steady. She stopped in the very center of the vast, circular hall, directly before the assembled alphas, a lone figure holding the attention of an entire kingdom. She did not look at Kale or Lyra. Her gaze swept across the powerful, skeptical faces of the regional alphas, men who held the fate of thousands in their hands. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was so clear and steady that it carried to every corner of the chamber. "My name is Nyssa Vale," she began. "I was a warrior of the Silver Moon Pack. For 10 years, I served my pack with honor. I defended our borders, I trained our young, I was betrothed to the Alpha's son." She paused, letting the words sink in. She did not ask for pity. She did not raise her voice in anger. She simply recounted the facts, her tone as sharp and clean as a blade. 3 weeks ago, my Alpha was poisoned. I was accused of this treason by my betrothed, Kale. His accusation was supported by the testimony of my closest friend, Lyra. I was given no trial. My pack mark was burned from my skin, and I was banished, cast out into the gloomwood to be hunted and killed by my own packmates. Her testimony was powerful in its brutal simplicity. It was a story of service, betrayal, and injustice, laid bare for all to see. I did not poison Alpha Marcus. I did not conspire with rogues. I did not betray my pack. I was betrayed. She finished, her voice ringing with the undeniable clarity of truth, and then she fell silent, her unflinching gaze challenging any wolf in the room to call her a liar. The hall was utterly still, the alphas caught between their political allegiances and the powerful, unadorned truth of her words. Before the murmurs could begin, Dominic stepped forward, his face a mask of cold fury. "You have heard the testimony," he declared. "Now you will see the proof." He produced a scroll, the mercenary's confession, and had it read aloud by his herald. The words detailing the plot, the poison, the staged attack, fell like hammer blows into the silence. Then he produced the second letter, Lyra's letter. As the herald's voice read out her desperate damning words, her pleas to Chaol to make her his Luna now that Nyssa was gone, a wave of revulsion and understanding swept the hall. The conspiracy was laid bare, ugly and undeniable. Chaol's face, once so arrogant, was now a mask of pure, cornered rage. Exposed, humiliated, he did the only thing a rabid animal knows how to do. He attacked. With a guttural roar that was more beast than man, he lunged forward, his body twisting and contorting, shifting mid-stride into his massive wolf form. But before he could take 2 steps, 2 blurs of silver and black slammed into him from either side. Dominic's royal guard, who had been standing like statues, moved with lethal speed, their own shifted forms crashing into Chaol, pinning his snarling, snapping wolf to the stone floor. At the same moment, Lyra collapsed in a heap, her body racked with hysterical sobs, her confession a torrent of choked, incoherent words that confirmed everything. The trial was over. Dominic's judgment was swift and absolute, his voice ringing with the cold finality of a death knell. Chaol of Silvermoon and Marcus of Silvermoon, who stood by and allowed this treachery to fester, you are hereby stripped of your rank, your titles, and your lands. You are banished. You will be taken to the barren lands of the north, to live out your days as rogues, the very thing you falsely branded another. The Silvermoon Pack is now under my direct authority, until such time as a worthy alpha can be found. He looked down at the pinned, struggling form of Chaol, his eyes devoid of mercy. Justice has been served. The pronouncement of justice hung in the air, a final, definitive chord that resonated through the great hall. For a moment, the only sound was the pathetic, choked sobbing of Lyra and the strained, furious growls of the pinned Chaol. The tension that had gripped the kingdom for weeks did not just dissipate, it shattered. A collective exhalation swept through the assembled alphas, a sound of profound relief. The war was over before it had begun. The crisis was averted. Then, one by one, the alphas who had stood with Chaol, their faces a mixture of shame and newfound respect, began to move. The first to approach the dais was a grim mountain of a man, Alpha Borin of the Stonefall Pack, known for his stubborn pride. He walked to the foot of the throne and bowed low, first to Dominic, then, with deliberate significance, to Nyssa. "My king," he rumbled, his voice like grinding stones, "your justice is as sharp as your claws. We were misled." He then looked directly at Nyssa, his hard eyes holding a grudging admiration. "My Luna, you have the heart of a warrior and the strength of a true alpha. Forgive my doubt." Nyssa's breath caught. Luna. He had called her Luna. She looked at Dominic, who gave her the slightest, most encouraging of nods. She straightened her shoulders, accepting the title, accepting the apology. "There is nothing to forgive, Alpha Borin," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Truth has a way of being obscured by lies. Today, it has been brought into the light." Borin nodded, satisfied, and stepped back. He was followed by another, and then another. The tense council transformed into a celebration, not of revelry, but of restored order. Alphas who had been prepared to march against Dominic now approached the throne to renew their pledges of loyalty, their gazes no longer holding suspicion, but a deep, abiding respect for the king who would risk a war for justice, and for the woman who had inspired such devotion. Nyssa stood at Dominic's side, a queen in all but name, accepting their fealty with a grace and confidence that felt entirely, surprisingly, natural. The weight of being an outcast, a traitor, had been lifted, and in its place, a sense of purpose was beginning to settle. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a part of something larger than herself, a partner to the man who had saved her in more ways than one. Later that night, long after the last of the alphas had departed and a weary peace had settled over the castle, the noise and lingering tension of the great hall felt suffocating. Dominic saw the exhaustion in Nyssa's eyes, the slight tremor in her hands now that the adrenaline had faded. He touched her elbow gently. "Come," he said softly, "walk with me." He led her away from the lingering servants and guards, through a small, unassuming door at the back of the hall and into the quiet of the moonlit gardens. The air was cool and fragrant, a stark contrast to the stuffy heat of the hall. The scent of night-blooming jasmine, sweet and intoxicating, hung heavy in the air. Moonlight, as bright and silver as Dominic's eyes, washed the world in ethereal light, turning the leaves of the ancient trees to silver and the petals of the white roses to pearl. The only sounds were the gentle chirping of crickets and the soft, musical splash of a hidden fountain. The weight of the trial, of the entire ordeal, seemed to lift from Nyssa's shoulders, carried away on the cool night breeze. They walked in a comfortable silence, the kind that needs no words, their shoulders occasionally brushing. It was a silence of shared victory, of profound understanding. Nyssa stopped beside a marble bench overlooking a tranquil pond where koi fish drifted like living jewels beneath the moonlit surface. She turned to face Dominic, the man who had defied his counsel, his kingdom, and centuries of tradition for her. The man who had believed in her when she no longer believed in herself. The moonlight caught the silver threads in her gown, making her shimmer, but the brightest light came from her eyes, which were full of an emotion he had longed to see there since the moment he had first laid eyes on her in the gloomwood. Trust. Pure, unconditional trust. Slowly, she reached up, her fingers trembling slightly, and gently traced the faint, silvery lines of the mate mark on the side of his neck, the mark that had declared her his from the very beginning. His skin was warm beneath her touch, and a jolt of that same protective, anchoring energy she had felt in his study flowed into her, but this time, she did not pull away. She welcomed it. "You were right," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "The bond, it isn't a cage." Her gaze met his, and in their depths, he saw the last of her walls crumble into dust. "You didn't lock me away. You didn't hide me or treat me as a shameful secret. You gave me a sword, and you stood with me while I fought my own battle. You gave me back my honor, Dominic. You gave me back myself." With those words, she rose on her toes, her hands sliding from his neck to cup his jaw, and she pressed her lips to his. It was not a kiss of desperate passion or of grateful submission. It was a kiss of equals. It was a kiss of choice. It was a kiss that said, asterisk, "I see you. I trust you. I choose you." Asterisk. In that moment, as her lips met his, she did more than just kiss him. With every fiber of her being, with her mind, her heart, and her soul, she consciously and fully accepted the mate bond. It was not a surrender, it was an embrace. A wave of energy, warm and golden like the dawn, erupted from the point of their contact, flowing between them in a powerful, visible current. It was the feeling of two halves of a single soul finally, completely, clicking into place. The air around them shimmered, and Nyssa felt a strange, tingling heat spread across her left shoulder, the very spot where Kale's brand had left its ugly mark. She gasped against his lips and pulled back, her eyes wide. Dominic looked at her, his own eyes glowing with a fierce silver light, his expression one of awe. "Nyssa," he breathed. She reached up and pulled back the collar of her midnight blue gown, her fingers fumbling with the fabric. She looked down, and she gasped again, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. Where the ugly, puckered, and twisted scar from her banishment had been, a permanent, hateful reminder of her betrayal and loss, there was now only smooth, unblemished skin. And blooming upon that skin, as if it had been drawn by the moonlight itself, was a new mark. It was the Alpha King's crest, a snarling wolf's head crowned with a star, perfectly formed and shining with a soft, internal silver light. The scar was gone. The symbol of her pain, her isolation, and her shame had been utterly erased, healed and replaced by a symbol of her new life, her new pack, her new beginning. It was a brand of belonging, a mark of honor, a testament to a bond that could not only heal a soul, but rewrite its very history. The final scene takes place weeks later. The kingdom had settled into a new rhythm, a peaceful and prosperous one under the unified rule of its king and his chosen Luna. Nyssa and Dominic stood on the highest balcony of the castle, looking out over their domain as the dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. His arm was wrapped securely around her waist, her hand resting over his, and her head rested comfortably on his shoulder. They were not just mates, bound by fate. They were partners, bound by choice, respect, and a love that had been forged in the fires of betrayal and injustice. Below them, the capital city was stirring to life, the smoke from countless hearths rising in lazy spirals into the cool morning air. The kingdom was at peace, thriving under their joint watch. Nyssa was no longer haunted by the ghosts of her past. The memories were still there, but they no longer had the power to wound her. She had risen from the ashes of her old life, not as a mere survivor clinging to existence, but as a beloved and respected queen, a ruler who led with compassion, strength, and a wisdom born from suffering. The Gloomwood had taken a broken, banished wolf, but the Alpha King had found his mate, and in claiming her, he had not caged a rogue, but crowned a queen. Her fate was no longer written in the scars of her past, but in the silver light of their shared future, a future where the Alpha and his Luna would rule together, their love the foundation of a kingdom reborn.